Today, we're going to be talking about minimalism, but not just minimalism in the terms of what is minimalism. See how many times I can mess that word up. But not just what minimalism is, but also has become, and also what it may have paved the way for us as a society in the United States. So minimalism originally was an art movement from the 1960s that originated in New York City, kind of as a counter movement to the counter movement. How many counter movements are there here? But a counter movement to the kind of excess of design and style that had really taken precedence in how so much of the 1960s kind of art and music and activist movements were going. And a large part of that explosion in color and in excess was coming from the adoption by American white communities of other cultures. And in the 60s, a lot of that, especially because of the civil rights movement, was with a fantasized version of African countries, Egypt and India, especially with the kind of normalization and integration, I should say, of thought movements that were more open to Eastern philosophies and Eastern styles of living. So there was this counter movement of minimalism. And minimalism is essentially the idea that you should have less to be able to live your life more intentionally. Now, the concept of that is, one, it's kind of uniquely American in the ways that Americans do prioritize after the extreme boom of capitalism in the 1950s. The idea of having a lot of items and having a lot of things, inspired by a movement that happened in the 1920s that was an attempt to make it easier for people who were not as wealthy to feel more, I think, socially accepted and elegant in their lack of items because they didn't have the capital to purchase excess. In the 1960s, when minimalism started as an art movement, it was starting in a space that was an interesting combination of both the least wealthy of Americans and the most in the art world, who were kind of integrating and to a degree challenging their understandings of classism. After the end of the 60s and the sense of letdown that a lot of younger Americans had when it came to their sense of being able to change the system because of the civil rights movement and the protesting of the Vietnam War, and that not actually changing as much as they thought, not really overthrowing as much as they thought. There was a lot of the sense of letdown and of giving in, essentially, to capitalism and all these other things, and that there definitely wasn't space within any of that for minimalism to continue. Instead, we had a lot of other different styles, especially as technology developed, that really, really changed what we as a populace were focused on. As technology became a center stage towards our identification of wealth and access. So there was definitely a big shift that started to happen. We got very excited about electronics. We got very excited about the digital new age and what was going to happen. So there wasn't really space for minimalism. But something kind of similar to what happened in the 60s happened again in the mid-2010s. In the early 2010s, there was the whole indie sleaze movement, challenging traditional norms about gender, and also a lot of activist movements towards changing local ideologies or national ideology. They had been through a couple of major destabilizing events because of the war in Iraq and Afghanistan, that started in the early 2000s, and also the major financial crisis of 2008 that led to a radical restructuring of how we operated as a country. The eldest of the millennials wanted something drastic to feel clear and clean and ready to go and be able to tackle all of the expectations that were still so heavy for people of that era. And you start seeing by 2015 this intense interest in minimalism. Overconsumption at the same time in the US has become such an intense thing that it's become a joke. Back when they were doing Black Friday in person, there were stampedes happening at these different malls, these stores, that people would get really hurt. There was a lot of pressure on different companies to have workers come in on Thanksgiving Day earlier and earlier and earlier because people were camping out to go purchase things. Were they things that anyone I would like actively needed? I can't really say. But at the same time, there was definitely this sense of exhaustion with overconsumption. And so minimalism became a big trend. And a lot of people adapted it as a full lifestyle because it required a sense of deprogramming from traditional American thinking at that point, where it had become very, very integrated into American culture to buy things and to try and compete with people about having the newest thing. There was definitely a group of influencers who were able to rise to the top because of their whole kind of documentation, vlog style documentation of their minimalist lifestyles and decluttering. And it became almost like associated with this spiritual mental health support thing. But before, I would argue many people talked about mental health the way we do now. So I actually want to show you all these guys. They're literally called the Minimalists. So it's Joshua Fields Milburn is the blonde person. And then Ryan Nicodemus is the person with the long brown hair. And they are two men who were very wealthy because they had worked in the tech industry and they had exploded in popularity, or at least they had become extraordinarily successful in that arena, in the Silicon Valley arena. And they were both in a state of feeling burned out. They were like, well, I bought everything I could want. I have all the money I could want. Why do I still feel empty? Why do I still not feel fulfilled? And grown men will do anything but go to therapy. Instead of, maybe deconstructing any of the reasons that could be, they just kind of decided that it was the physical items they owned that were the problem. So, like any good capitalists, what did they decide to do? They decided to write multiple books, 4, I think at this point, and spread their word when it came to the importance of minimalism and decluttering. And they had 2 different TED Talks where they talked about the way that they decided to change their whole lives. Joshua, his mother had actually passed away, and it was like a big kind of eureka moment for him to realize, as he was looking at her house full of things, that he didn't want any of them. But he also felt conflicted about what to do with it. So he took pictures of the things that had the most sentimentality for him, and then he gave or threw or sold everything away. Everything. And that was a big crux of their message, was sentimentality is almost like a dangerous thing, or it is unhealthy. Now, a lot of the kind of key talking points that they had weren't negative. They were more about in a society that values overconsumption and you're constantly being sold to, it was more like, well, why not try and live in a more intentional way where you are interacting with the world and your communities on a more direct level? And that's, I can't fault that. I think that's great. But they would kind of focus that on the physical items they had. because they would go on tour giving speeches about the benefits of being a minimalist and how much it had positively changed their lives, which definitely, I think, contributed to the popularization of minimalism on an even grander scale. So from like 2015 to maybe 2018, it got like minimalism got even more and even more and even more popular. And it became something that was definitely more common to see in a very specific class of people. Can you guess who? Wealthier people. So minimalism became almost like a calling card for being someone who was mindful and for being someone who was serious. And a really good example of that is actually Gwyneth Paltrow was fighting a suit in the mid-late 2010s and made a very specific decision with her stylist to not dress in a way that was that could be seen as excessive. So she wore very toned down things with no color. At most, maybe like a dark navy blue. It was grays. It was whites. It was blacks, and her clothing looked like you could probably find it at Ross. So she looked like a very normal, everyday person during her trial. And the stylists the world over were raving about it. Now, what a lot of people who wouldn't know is that all of her outfits were hundreds of thousands of dollars. She walked into court one day wearing $58,000 worth of jewelry for a thin little gold chain and some earrings. So yes, minimalism, but is it really minimalist if the items that she's wearing or purchasing or does have are extraordinarily expensive? That's a good question. What that did, though, is it kicked off this fad for high-profile celebrities to have minimalist spaces to be more relatable to the general public so that they could be seen as more, if you went into their houses didn't have excessive ornate things everywhere. They'd have what is called quiet luxury. So they would have these, I'll show you a picture, for example, of Kim K's house. She did she did a house tour with Vogue, and I'm going to show a little video of that in a second. And this is one of her rooms, one of the many rooms that she has in her house. And as you can see, it is all white. Everything is kind of this soft, rounded look. It looks like it's kind of melting into the walls. It just looks very bland. But also, it is, you could argue, very comforting. So when she adopted this look, Kim K adopted this look, it kind of became the epitome of wealthy, the top 0.01% of people using the concept of, or the aesthetic of minimalism. But were they really ascribing to the mentality of it? Maybe not. Because let me show you her little house tour. There's something I think that is important, and the reason I'm showing all of you these things in this way is for a reason. I'm going to get into it right after the video. So here we go.
We're here in my home once again. A few things have been updated. I've filled it up with some amazing art and all my favorite things. I can't wait to show you. We're in my family kitchen, and everything in my house is really minimal. I find that there's so much chaos out in the world that when I come home, I want it to be just really quiet, and I want everything to feel calming. It's like in the main house, I really like the calmness. And shockingly, 4 kids hasn't messed up my cream house.
The couches at the end Those couches cost more than a house. In that particular short house tour that she did with Vogue, she showed 3 rooms of her house, and every single one was in this kind of creamy beige color. And it was all very rounded corners. Things looked like they had been kind of molded out of clay and left there. And it doesn't look expensive, but the amount of money that all costs is in the multi-millions. And her house itself is this sprawling, huge estate. And the house was also very much a controversial topic at the time because it had been a very carefully built house by a particular architect who had like a very specific style that was, highly regarded. And so she gutted the house, removed all of the things that made it, I guess, iconic, and recreated it into this style. And what's kind of important about this conversation and why I'm bringing this up in this way is because minimalism, when we were first talking about it, started out as the whole goal was to live intentionally. Now, instead, it ends up as a calling card for the ultimately, like the most wealthy, to show themselves as on trend and also willing to spend ridiculous amounts of money to be able to maintain and afford a house like that. In the clip, she talks about having 4 kids, and it's amazing that they haven't gotten anything dirty. It's amazing. Well, the reason that has happened is because she has an army of cleaning staff to help her. And a lot of, the average American would see this and think, oh, well, I can do that too, and try and recreate that look. But it is really hard to be able to maintain interior spaces like this, maybe less consumption based, and instead way more focused on having these indicators of class that are dressed in a different design that traditionally indicate wealth. And it became a bit of the end of the minimalism movement, but that really, really hit in the 2020 because everybody was, through the pandemic, at home. And when you're at home and you don't have anything in your home, you can't connect with other people. You can't spend your money that you saved on traveling. If your goal was to be able to afford the expectations that were placed on you when you were growing up of having a house and being able to afford kids and all of those things, if you're in a tiny house with your kids, or even just with your partner or by yourself, and you don't really have the ability to connect to other people, and there's nothing in your house, it can make it very difficult to pass the time. And it definitely affected a lot of people's mental health. But there's another insidious component of what that ultimately did on a larger scale, because by the time Kim K had adopted minimalism, it became a sign of the upper class of wealth, and also the aesthetic of minimalism became more important than the mentality behind it. Clothing-wise and style-wise, even if you look at how Kim K is dressed, she's got a neckline that goes all the way up here. Her hair is very severely pulled back. She's got the gold hoops that are tasteful. Everything is very expensive, but it's also quite modest. So it introduced an opportunity for something else. And what was that something else? Trad wives. So especially, minimalism was on, kind of its last legs, because it was really hard to maintain minimalism when you're home all the time and you're trying to keep yourself engaged. And also when you're sitting in a house that doesn't have any ornamentation on it, our brains don't do well in those spaces. That is one reason that correctional spaces, punitive spaces, generally don't have any ornamentation, or they only have the cheapest kind of lighting. It's because your brain doesn't like that. It is another form of punishment. And if you're somebody who's like kind of out and about all the time, then that's not going to bother you as much as allow you to reset after a long day of being exposed to a lot of light, sound, and advertisements. But when you're not being exposed to those external stressors anymore, and instead you're home, it starts to weigh on you. So people started to bring color back into their homes. They started to bring, I guess, personal projects and crafting and mess back into their spaces. There was also a awareness that had happened as people had to slow down and stop and look at the way that their lives were structured and really think about what they were doing with their lives and what they wanted. It meant that there were two pretty extreme differences in how people navigated that. On one hand, you had people who ended up kind of going towards more leftist and progressive thought patterns and feeling and recognizing all of the systemic injustices that are a problem. And, there was, of course, the very important work that was done by BLM. And there was a opportunity, I think, for people to really decide what they were doing day to day and how they wanted to operate in the world. Now, on the other hand, there became a resurgence in finding comfort in familiarity without as much pressure by being in their family's space all the time, or being home alone, or only being able to connect with people online. A lot of people wanted to start, try exploring baking and trying to, feel more classy and elegant when, especially when people aren't able to make that much money because of the pandemic and a lot of people couldn't go into work. You were trying to conserve money. So the kind of clean girl aesthetic definitely became way more normalized. And there are certain influencers who decided to hop onto the kind of slowly fading out minimalism trend and rebrand it into a more conservative structure. And then we have to bring in her. We have definitely all seen this woman. I am blanking on her name so hard right now, it's not even funny. Her entire content is all about being a stay-at-home wife who is deeply, deeply evangelically Christian, raising her kids at home and like from scratch making all the food in their house. And they live in this very wealthy space. And so it's like an adoption and amalgamation of what Kim K was doing with the aesthetics of minimalism, and then bringing in almost puritanical values about how a family should be structured. Well, also, which, should be two opposite things, but using quiet luxury, like excess wealth and elegance, to form something new. And at that point in time, there was a lot of pressure and political struggle because of the election that would have determined if Orange Cheeto Man got another chance at the presidency, or if Joe Biden was going to come in. And the entire pandemic, that was a really, really big point of contention. And then when Joe Biden did end up winning, it solidified, I think, on a cultural level within the US, more of a focus on preserving what was seen as like white culture, which was also being seen as under attack by communities of color. Now, there's something important too that goes into this with minimalism, is that up until now, we haven't really discussed how minimalism leaves space for different community practices, cultural heritage. If anything, it seems as if it is devoid of cultural heritage and instead favors almost like a blank canvas so that people can decide for themselves where to go next. But the problem is that actually helps encourage some not very great ideas. So I have another little video I want y'all to see real quick that kind of addresses this really well.
To look like this? Probably not. Because we've been conditioned to believe the most ideal form of design looks more like this. At the time in the design world, minimalism is upheld as the gold standard. It's pushed almost to the spiritual form of lifestyle. Netflix even made this documentary Minimalism and documentary about the important things. However, complex ornamental design was a deep and significant part of human culture since the dawn of humans. Basically, since people started clothing themselves. It was until about 1931, when Adolf Loos, an Austrian architect, wrote Ornament and Crime. He compares excessive ornamentation to being something that's criminal and inhuman. You can pause here to read it. It's really bad. This is him, by the way. Ugh. The problem is, this essay became a seminal text in many architecture circles. There's a lot of really good minimal design out there. It's based on a history of cultural erasure and fascism. And I don't know, I just wish more of the world looked like this.
Okay, so that brings up a kind of unspoken part of minimalism that up until, the mid-2020s, a lot of people weren't really discussing on a grand scale. And a lot of the influencers that had been able to rise to fame because of their content focused on minimalism hadn't really discussed was how much it was marketed towards. It's the irony of being an anti-consumption movement, but it was marketed towards generally wealthier to middle class to upper middle class white families and people, as well as obviously the Kim K's of the world. And it was something that, earlier we talked about the minimalists, and it was definitely jumped on by Silicon Valley as another opportunity to create money for whoever was willing to use that movement in their favor. But what it effectively, unfortunately, does is it removes any cultural heritage that you can have. Because if you're one big key component of a lot of traditional elements, especially, it's Ramadan right now. It's also the Chinese New Year celebration. And so, these are just examples of really healthy, normal components of different cultures from around the world that are all represented in the United States. We're instead getting, people are being encouraged to remove that from their lives, to operate on more of a blank slate of existence. It's almost as if colorblindness was being used to create an anti-consumption movement. And it definitely gave a space for people who were feeling disaffected about their place in the country because they were maybe, after everything going on in 2020 and the pandemic and the very important social movements and the calls for reform that had been instigated because of those movements, it really made a lot of people uncomfortable because suddenly they had to navigate and face their privilege if they were like white Americans. And some people responded to that by wholeheartedly embracing it, recognizing it, and diving deeper. And other people reacted as if you held a dead rat in front of them. And it was very, very polarizing. So it kind of encouraged a new form of minimalism. I guess you could call this the Grage or the clean girl era, where it was very much it got adopted by like the red pill movement. It got adopted by more conservative movements because of the ease in which you could integrate evangelical mentalities about family, gender norms, a woman's place is in the home, making food for her family, a man's place is out in the workforce, attaining capitalistic goals, and not allowing not being allowed to cry and only being allowed to feel anger. Like it's definitely these like very ultra traditional conservative mentalities as a way to avoid a lot of the deeper issues that were present in the United States that had been forced into the light because of the pandemic. And so you definitely saw this explosion of maximalism in alternative communities, from people who maybe fall into the more cutesy spaces like me to the more like recognizable like goth and punk and alt communities. And it became as well a signal of class and wealth, because when you're poor, you want to hold on to things because if you can't afford, if something breaks, to buy another one. Instead, you have to try and keep using the thing that you have until it's completely unusable. And even then, sometimes you keep holding on to it because I am remembering when I had a pair of shoes that I literally kept duct taping together until they were all duct tape. There was only the soles of the shoe and duct tape. And people were kind of falling into the more minimalist and clean girl aesthetic style, going into that whole space to then start getting content that was about trad wives, and maybe it would start with like, well, I like to make things from home, and I like to have know where all of the ingredients are coming from that go into my food, and ensuring that my family is eating healthy. And it kind of interestingly captured a whole swath of people who probably wouldn't have been the main targets otherwise for more evangelical or Christian mentalities. And with time, that has definitely morphed again into something very different, where you have, people who have more stereotypical, ostentatious displays of wealth, especially once Trump was elected for a second time. Ostentatious became once again a symbol of idealization for more conservative people. Minimalism is really interesting because its original goals were to be all about kind of divesting from the traditional system of overconsumption within the country and the social pressures to be able to afford a house and kids and marriage and car and all the things that you were supposed to have to signal your adultness. But it was missing a really important component, and that was community. So even the minimalists, the two men who I showed you earlier, who made a huge profit off of selling books about minimalism. They had 2 documentaries that were almost like word for word the same, selling their idea of minimalism.
Becoming a minimalist is just the first step. How many times do we get the question where they're like, man, I've like minimized, I've downsized, I've organized, I got really good relationships in my life, but now what?
The other problem we have is thinking we need to fill the time now. I got rid of this, what should I replace it with? I got rid of this relationship, what should I replace it with? I got rid of this item, what should I replace it with? I got rid of this career, what should I replace it with? I got rid of this home, what should I replace it with? Well, maybe you don't need to replace it with anything. Maybe you can make peace and even feel peace because of that void.
So again, I feel like that clip kind of really illustrates this whole conundrum that a lot of people who had been really, really invested in minimalist styles, minimalist thought, fell into, was once they had accomplished the goal, what then? Because it also, I think, is another key indicator as to why it was so purposely marketed to wealthier members of our communities. There is definitely a wealth disparity within the United States, and there's also a higher likelihood that people who are able to attain wealth in the United States are more likely to be white. And by default, white in America is very different than white in any other part of the world, because in most other parts of the world, you're not necessarily seen as white, you're seen as whichever community you're a part of. So if you're Irish, you're going to have traditional folk and community structure and practice and ritual that help guide people through life and also establish community. But in the US, because we are fortunately a nation full of immigrants, when a lot of people got here, in order to establish a dominance between different groups of immigrants, anyone who was paler were able to be kind of grouped together in order to ensure that those of us who have more melanin are identifiably different and as such easier to classify as less than, and also to always be painted as the enemy or the problem. Case in point, what's going on right now with ICE, and what has happened again and again and again and again in our history. But for all of the people who this was marketed to, it leaves you with very little. It's just as damaging in some ways as, though at least not minimalism in intent, but the minimalism that became popular, especially the ones that was being like peddled by these two, is it encourages almost this lack of, where instead of having identifiable sense of self or any structure that is community based and interacting with others, it's more about almost transactional. If you decide to sell your possessions or get rid of your possessions for whatever intention, positive or negative, that doesn't mean that you are then entitled to some type of like sense of purpose or presence in the world, or that you are now included in a community. It doesn't actually include you in a community to get rid of or have items. Just like the physical things that we possess don't do more for us as people outside of their utilitarian uses than to help indicate to others if we are safe or not safe, and serve as community flags of positive or negative. Like if somebody has a lot of MAGA gear, I'm probably going to be able to safely assume it's not safe to be around them. If somebody has a lot of cute things, I'm probably going to be like, there's something in some way that we are going to be able to connect on. So it becomes a very different marker of opportunity for community. Whereas if you have made this whole like structure of your life to not have anything, then if that is the point, then there's very little to help communicate to others your values or what you stand for. And so there is this sentiment that definitely started to ring quite strongly within this minimalism space of, now what? And that is, I think, where, again, those influencers I was talking about earlier, like the trad wives and the kind of integration of minimalist mentality and aesthetic especially into wealth became established, I guess. There was a void that was still left over because things don't replace community, and things don't replace mental health, and things don't replace connection. So having or not having doesn't indicate if you are a good person or not. It doesn't indicate if you have a healthy way to connect to other people and make friends. It simply means that, like, if you are more focused on environmental concerns, then that is the method that you have to be able to connect to others. Perhaps that means that you have more openness to activism in ecological activism and things like that. But it is not at core the point of the minimalist movement in the way that it was ultimately interpreted by people like the Minimalists and ultimately people like Kim K. It became a calling card to be able to sell to others. And then it became adopted and unfortunately co-opted into a way to integrate more conservative ideology and red pilling and also evangelical Christian mentalities. I'm not even going to get into a conversation about the positives or negatives of Christianity. It is a religion. There are positives and negatives just as in any other religion. But inherently, evangelical Christianity is very much focused on integrating, especially with Christian nationalism, on integrating themselves into politics. We had a conversation about that with Project 2025 in our last live stream when we were talking about the Section 230 passing, or hopefully not passing, that was brought on by the Heritage Foundation, which is a whole problem. But minimalism is interesting because I personally feel like it may have paved the way unintentionally for this shift to the alt-right and the extreme right that we have seen. Because again, once there becomes a lack of identifiable community structure or culture, and the only identifying feature that you have if you ascribe to like a minimalist mentality is not necessarily about living more intentionally, but instead about reacting to your identification of privilege, which is what happened to a whole swath of the population post BLM and George Floyd. Something needs to come swoop you up, and it is much easier for Christian nationalism and then MAGA to do that. But at the same time, there's still lots of minimalists, people who are very, very involved in the minimalist movement in the mid-2010s, who to this day still very much believe in minimalism and operate on a minimalist lifestyle and have gravitated more towards the activism component of it. And so it's not that there aren't opportunities to find positive meaning and community and joy by being a minimalist, but that it is not the only calling card. There are other ways that it can definitely be used to affect one's interpretation of everything from politics to your daily schedule. Now, I think this is kind of encapsulated the most by Pantone's color of the year for 2026, which is Cloud Dancer. It's white. It's a very beige white. Why? Now, if you don't know who Pantone is one of the oldest color and paint companies in the world, and they are seen as one of the foremost, I guess, experts when it comes to color in the world. And every year they announce a different color for the next year. So at the end of 2025, they announced what they believed their color for 2026 was going to be, and it was that white color Cloud Dancer, which is pulled straight out of the, I don't know, I think I've seen this before, Kim K's house, which again is kind of to me, an indicator of the way that while minimalism may have started as a very positive movement, it has absolutely been co-opted into something radically different. All right. Goodbye.